Councilman Richard Sterling strutted into Judge Caprio's courtroom, believing his power made him untouchable. He was about to discover that in this quiet hall of justice, true authority wasn't measured by a title, but by integrity. The air in Judge Caprio's courtroom usually felt humane. It wasn't like the sterile, intimidating halls of justice you see on TV. It was a place where people, real people with real problems, came for a measure of fairness. I'd practiced law in this city for 15 years, and an appearance before Judge Caprio was always a lesson in empathy and common sense. He was a pillar of the community, a man whose quiet integrity was legendary. But today the air was thick with a different kind of energy, something slick and toxic that emanated from the man sitting at the defendant's table, Councilman Richard Sterling. Sterling wasn't just a politician, he was an institution of arrogance. He wore a suit that probably cost more than my car, a shimmering silver tie knotted with precise aggression, and a watch that gleamed under the fluorescent lights, catching the eye every time he gestured dismissively. He wasn't just wearing the suit, he was wielding it as armor, a clear signal that he was from a different, better world than the rest of us. My client, a sweet, terrified woman in her 60s named Mrs. Gable, looked like a sparrow next to his hawk. Her crime? Her family's bakery of 60 years stood in the way of Sterling's pet project, a luxury condo development. He'd used every dirty trick in the municipal codebook to try and force her out, culminating in a fabricated health code violation that I was now trying to get thrown out. From the moment the proceedings began, Sterling's contempt was palpable. While I laid out our case, he openly scrolled through his phone, a smirk plastered on his face. When Mrs. Gable spoke, her voice trembling as she described the endless targeted inspections, he sighed theatrically, as if her struggle was the most boring story he'd ever heard. Judge Caprio, as was his way, let it go. He watched, his chin resting on his steepled fingers, his gaze missing nothing. He had this way of looking at you, not through you, but into you, and I could see him taking the full measure of the councilman. The turning point came when I presented our key piece of evidence, an email chain, accidentally forwarded to a city clerk, from Sterling to the developer. In it, he was crystal clear. "Don't worry about the old lady and her bread shop," he'd written. "We'll tie her up in so much red tape she'll be begging to sell for pennies on the dollar. The building inspector is my guy. Consider it handled." A collective gasp rippled through the small gallery. Sterling's face, for the first time that morning, lost its smugness. A flash of pure fury replaced it. He slammed his hand lightly on the table, a controlled tap that was somehow more menacing than a loud bang. His lawyer, a nervous young man who looked like he was in way over his head, put a restraining hand on his arm. Sterling shook it off. "This is an outrage," Sterling muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "A complete fabrication." Judge Caprio looked up, his expression unreadable. "Councilman Sterling, you will be silent unless spoken to. Your lawyer can speak for you. That's what he's here for." Sterling just scoffed, a little puff of air that was pure disrespect. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms like a defiant teenager. The case continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. The councilman was no longer just arrogant, he was rattled, and that made him dangerous. When it was his turn to take the stand, he swaggered up, took the oath with an air of annoyance, and sat down as if he were taking his throne. His lawyer's questions were softballs, designed to paint him as a civic-minded leader just trying to improve the city. But on my cross-examination, his composure crumbled completely. I was calm, methodical, using his own words from the emails against him. "Councilman," I asked, "in this email you refer to the city's building inspector as my guy. Could you please explain to the court what you meant by that?" He sneered at me. "It's a figure of speech, counselor. It means he's a reliable city employee. Reliable enough to handle a senior citizen who stood in the way of your friend's business deal." His knuckles went white as he gripped the edge of the witness box. "This is a witch hunt. You're twisting my words," Judge Caprio interjected, his voice still even. "Councilman, please just answer the question." That's when Sterling made the mistake of his life. He swiveled his head, ignoring me completely, and looked directly at the judge. The disdain on his face was shocking. "With all due respect, Frank," he began. The use of the judge's first name a calculated slap in the face. The entire courtroom froze. "This whole proceeding is a joke. We all know how this works. I'm trying to bring progress to this city, to build its future, and I have to sit here and be cross-examined by some ambulance chaser and judged by a small-time local official playing to the cameras for his folksy TV show." The silence that followed was absolute. It was so deep you could hear the hum of the lights overhead. He wasn't done. He stood up slightly from the witness chair, pointing a finger at the bench. Your entire career is built on parking tickets and neighborhood squabbles. You have no idea what it takes to run a city. So why don't you stop this little theater and go back to what you do best, fining people for expired meters? Judge Caprio didn't bang his gavel. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at Sterling, and in that moment the entire room went cold. His eyes, usually filled with a grandfatherly warmth, were now like chips of ice. He slowly, deliberately, took off his reading glasses, polished them with a corner of his robe, and placed them perfectly parallel on the bench in front of him. The calm was more terrifying than any outburst could ever be. Judge Caprio let the silence stretch, letting Sterling's words hang in the air like poison gas. He let every person in that room, the clerk, the bailiffs, the handful of spectators, me, and especially Councilman Sterling himself, fully absorb the depth of the disrespect that had just been shown. It was a masterclass in control. Sterling, who had intended to seize the moment, now just looked like a petulant fool stewing in a quiet he couldn't break. His own lawyer wouldn't even look at him, staring instead at a spot on the carpet, as if trying to will himself into another dimension. Finally, the judge spoke. His voice was no louder than a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the room, a blade of sound that cut through the tension. "Mr. Sterling," he said. The shift from councilman to Mr. was a demotion so profound it was almost a physical blow. "Please, resume your seat." Sterling, who was still half standing, hesitated for a moment, his face a mask of confusion and indignation. He looked to his lawyer, who gave a frantic, almost imperceptible shake of his head. With a huff, Sterling sat back down, the witness chair creaking under his weight. Judge Caprio looked over at me and Mrs. Gable, a flicker of apology in his eyes, as if to say, "I'm sorry you have to witness this." Then his gaze returned to Sterling, and the ice was back. "You mentioned my first name, Mr. Sterling. Frank. It's a good name. It was my father's name. But in this room, it is not my name. In this room, my name is Judge Caprio, and you will address me as Your Honor, not for my sake, Mr. Sterling, but for the sake of the office I hold. An office that serves the very same people you took an oath to serve, an oath I am now beginning to question if you even remember." He paused, letting that sink in. Sterling's jaw was tight, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "You also referred to the business of this court as parking tickets and neighborhood squabbles," the judge continued, his voice still unnervingly calm. "You are correct. We handle many such cases. Yesterday, I had a young mother in here, a single mom with 2 jobs, who had a parking ticket she couldn't afford to pay because it would mean her kids wouldn't eat for 2 days. To you, Mr. Sterling, that is a triviality. To her, it was the most important, most terrifying crisis in her world. We helped her. We found a solution. Is that not the purpose of running a city?" He leaned forward slightly. "You speak of progress and big projects. You see a city as a collection of buildings and revenue streams. But I see it as a collection of people. People like that mother. People like Mrs. Gable, whose family has been a cornerstone of this community since before you or I were even born. You see her bakery as an obstacle. I see it as part of the city's heart. A heart you seem intent on carving out to make way for glass and steel." He picked up the email printout from his desk. "This isn't about progress, Mr. Sterling. This is about bullying. It's about a man who believes his title and his expensive suit make him better than everyone else. A man who thinks the rules are for the small people he looks down upon." Sterling couldn't take it anymore. He shot to his feet. "This is absurd. I will not be lectured by—" "You will be silent." Judge Caprio's voice cracked through the room like a whip. It was the first time I had ever heard him raise it. The sudden sonic boom of it made Sterling physically flinch. The bailiff took a step forward, his hand resting on his sidearm. "You will sit down, and you will listen," the judge commanded, his voice returning to a low, dangerous growl. "You came into this room believing you were untouchable. You insulted a citizen of this city. You insulted my court, and you insulted the very system of justice that gives you the right to even be here. The matter of Mrs. Gable's case is now concluded. All citations are dismissed with prejudice. I am further directing the city attorney's office to open a formal investigation into the conduct of the building inspector's office and your relationship with this developer." A sob of relief escaped Mrs. Gable's lips. I squeezed her hand. It was over. We'd won. But it wasn't over. Not for Sterling. Judge Caprio looked at me. Counselor, you and your client are excused. Your business here is finished. I nodded, helping a shaking Mrs. Gable to her feet. As we walked past the defendant's table, I glanced at Sterling. His face was pale, his bravado completely gone, replaced by the dawning horror of a man who has just realized he has picked a fight with an opponent he cannot possibly beat. He looked trapped. As we reached the door, I heard Judge Caprio speak again, his voice now clinical and cold. He was no longer a teacher or a community elder. He was the full, unyielding power of the law. "Mr. Sterling," he said, and I turned back just in time to see him gesture to the bailiff. "You have demonstrated a profound disconnect from the community you claim to serve. You hold contempt not just for this court, but for the everyday people whose lives you dismiss as small time. A fine will not teach you what you need to learn. A lecture clearly has failed. It seems a more practical lesson is required." He paused, his eyes locking onto Sterling's. "You see power as a penthouse view. I am going to show you what it looks like from the street." Mrs. Gable and I stood frozen by the courtroom door, caught in the gravitational pull of the moment. Leaving felt impossible. It was like trying to walk away from a lightning strike just as it hit the ground. Sterling's lawyer, a young man who looked like he had aged a decade in the last 10 minutes, scrambled to his feet, his objections a clumsy cascade of legal jargon. "Your Honor, I must object. This is unorthodox. My client is a public official. We demand a recess to discuss sentencing options. This is a clear abuse of judicial discretion." Judge Caprio didn't even glance at him. His focus was entirely on the man he had just metaphorically stripped bare. "Your objection is noted and overruled, Counselor. Sit down." The lawyer looked at the bailiff, then at his client, and deflated back into his chair, a man utterly out of his depth. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, his voice a low, resonant hum, "for your flagrant and willful contempt of this court, demonstrated by your repeated interruptions, your disrespectful language, and your blatant disregard for the sanctity of these proceedings, I find you guilty." He let the word "guilty" hang there for a beat. It was the first time Sterling had likely been found guilty of anything in his life. "As I said," the judge continued, "a fine would be meaningless to a man of your means, and locking you in a cell, well deserved, would be a waste of taxpayer money and an opportunity for learning. Your sentence, therefore, will be educational. It will consist of 120 hours of civic restitution, to be served over the next 30 days, without exception." Sterling let out a bitter, choked laugh. 120 hours? Doing what? Picking up trash on the highway? You can't be serious." "I am perfectly serious," Judge Caprio replied, his expression hardening. "But your service will be more specific. It will be tailored to the exact institutions and people you so casually belittled from that witness stand." He picked up a pen. "For the first 40 hours, you will report to the Parking Enforcement Division. You will be issued a uniform. You will walk a beat with a senior officer. You will not write tickets, but you will be the one to place them on the windshields. You will be the one to explain to frustrated citizens why their meter has expired. You will learn, firsthand, what it's like to be on the receiving end of the public's anger over what you called fining people for expired meters." Sterling's face was turning a blotchy red. "This is a joke." "I assure you, it is not," the judge said, making a note on a legal pad. "For the next 40 hours, you will report to the Department of Sanitation, specifically the crew that services the downtown commercial district. Your district. You will help keep the city you claim to be building clean. You will learn that the progress you champion rests on the shoulders of men and women who do the hard, unglamorous work you pretend doesn't exist." Sterling looked like he was going to be physically sick, but the judge wasn't finished. "And for your final 40 hours, Mr. Sterling, you will be assigned to the clerk's office. Right here, in this courthouse. You will not be making policy. You will be making copies. You will be stamping documents. You will be answering the phone and assisting the very people you called small time as they navigate their neighborhood squabbles. You will stand behind the counter and serve them with respect. You will, in effect, become the small-time local official you hold in such contempt." He put the pen down. "Refusal to comply with any part of this sentence will result in your immediate incarceration for a period of no less than 6 months. The choice is yours." It was a checkmate, a brilliant, inescapable trap built from Sterling's own arrogance. He could accept public humiliation, or he could go to jail, a move that would be political suicide. His entire body trembled with a rage he couldn't unleash. His eyes darted around the room, looking for an exit, an ally, anything. He found only the impassive face of the bailiff and the steady, unwavering gaze of the judge. "This is a political hit job," he finally spat out, his voice cracking. "I'll appeal this. I'll take this to the Supreme Court. I will have your robe, Caprio. I swear to God I will." Judge Caprio simply nodded. "You have the right to appeal, Mr. Sterling, but the sentence begins tomorrow morning, 6 a.m., at the Sanitation Department depot on Elm Street. Pending that appeal, the sentence stands. Now for the last time, do you accept these terms, or shall I have the bailiff escort you to a holding cell?" Defeated, Sterling sagged. The fight went out of him, replaced by a sullen, simmering hatred. He looked at his lawyer, who could only shrug helplessly. Through gritted teeth, he mumbled, "I accept." "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, Mr. Sterling," the judge said calmly. "I accept," Sterling shouted, the sound echoing in the silent room. "Very good," Judge Caprio said, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He gathered his papers, ready to adjourn. It seemed the spectacle was finally over. But then he paused, one hand on his gavel, as if a final thought had just occurred to him. "There is one final condition," he said, his voice taking on a new, almost theatrical tone. He looked directly at the councilman, whose head snapped up in alarm. "You seem particularly offended by the presence of a camera in my courtroom, accusing me of playing to a folksy TV show. You seem to believe that justice should be hidden, that accountability is something for the little people. I disagree." He looked toward the back of the courtroom, where the single-court camera operator was packing up his gear. "Therefore, to ensure your full compliance and for the broader civic education of the public, a camera crew will document your entire 120 hours of service. All of it. The footage will be made available as a public record. You wanted to be a star of a show, Mr. Sterling. Well, congratulations, you've got one." The silence in the courtroom was shattered by a strangled, inhuman sound from Sterling. It was the sound of a man's entire world crumbling in a single, perfectly orchestrated moment. A camera crew. Public record. It wasn't just a sentence, it was a public vivisection. Judge Caprio had taken Sterling's own weapon, his belief in the power of image and public perception, and turned it into an instrument of his humiliation. Sterling's lawyer was on his feet, babbling about privacy and precedent, but his words were just white noise. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp, final crack. Court was adjourned. The story became an instant legend in the city. Sterling's service, they called it. The first day was a media circus. Every local news channel was at the Sanitation Department depot at 6 a.m. to see Councilman Sterling, a man who usually started his day with a $1,000 espresso, fumbling to put on a bright orange jumpsuit. The footage was priceless. He looked shrunken, lost, his expensive suit replaced by fluorescent workwear. He recoiled when he was handed a pair of thick gloves and a trash grabber, looking at them as if they were venomous snakes. The camera followed him all day. It caught his grimace as he heaved overflowing bags of garbage into the back of a truck. It captured his shock when his supervisor, a no-nonsense woman named Maria, reprimanded him for leaning on a lamppost. "This ain't the city council, pretty boy," she'd barked, a line that immediately became a citywide catchphrase. "You get paid to work, not to model." The parking enforcement detail was even worse for him. He endured a constant barrage of heckling. People would drive by, honking and shouting, "How's the view from the street, Richie?" He tried to maintain his aloof, arrogant facade, but it was impossible when you're being screamed at by a furious mother whose minivan you've just had to ticket. I watched the footage online that night, and for the first time I saw a crack in his armor, a flicker of genuine, bewildered fear. He wasn't in control anymore. But the final 40 hours, the ones he spent in the courthouse clerk's office, were the true turning point. Stripped of his uniform and his political title, he was just Rich, the temp. He was surrounded by the very people he'd dismissed. He had to help a frantic young couple get a copy of their marriage license. He had to patiently explain the process for filing a small claims suit to an elderly man who was hard of hearing. He had to look Mrs. Gable's friends and neighbors in the eye as they came in to pay their property taxes. One afternoon I had to file a motion for another case, and I saw him. He was behind the counter, looking exhausted and utterly defeated. A young woman was there with her toddler, trying to sort out a confusing piece of paperwork. The child was crying. The woman was on the verge of tears herself, and Sterling looked like he was about to snap. I braced myself for an explosion. But then something shifted. He took a deep breath, knelt down to be at eye level with the little boy, and pulled a silly face. The toddler stopped crying and giggled. Sterling looked up at the mother, and with a voice I barely recognized, quiet, devoid of arrogance, he said, "Okay, let's take another look. We'll figure this out together." The final piece of footage the court released was from his last hour of service. Judge Caprio, in his suit, not his robes, walked into the clerk's office. Sterling saw him and stiffened, expecting a final confrontation, but the judge just walked up to the counter. "Mr. Sterling," he said quietly, "your 120 hours are complete. You are free to go." Sterling just stood there for a moment, looking at his hands, which were smudged with ink. "That's it?" he asked. "That's it," the judge confirmed. Sterling slowly took off the visitor's badge he'd been wearing and placed it on the counter. He looked around the bustling office, at the faces of the ordinary people he had been forced to serve. Then he looked at Judge Caprio. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said. The words were soft, but they were clear and they were genuine. There was no sarcasm, no lingering resentment. It was the simple acknowledgement of a man who had been profoundly and permanently humbled. Richard Sterling didn't run for re-election. He quietly finished his term and faded from public life. Mrs. Gable's bakery, now a local landmark, thrived. The city launched a full-scale investigation that cleaned out the corruption in the building inspector's office. But the real change was less tangible. The story of Sterling's sentence became a part of our city's folklore, a reminder that in the halls of justice, true power isn't measured by the cost of your suit or the weight of your title. It's measured by your character, and in Judge Caprio's courtroom, character was the one thing you couldn't appeal.